That is the base model M4 Mac Mini, and in this video I'm going to break it, although not with that, obviously. I'm not Mr. Beast or Jerry Rig, whatever his name is. When Apple announced the brand new Mac Mini a few weeks ago, I immediately pre-ordered two versions. The M4 Pro version with loads of cores and 64 gig of unified memory and a 2TB SSD that cost me 600 quid on its own, and a base model one. This one, 599 quid, $599. It's the cheapest Mac you can buy, and I think it has the potential, I'm going straight in with this, the potential not just only to be the best Mac Apple has ever made, but the best product they've ever made. That's a huge claim, and I know a lot of you are probably already furiously typing in the comments why I'm wrong and why something else was better than this, but hear me out. Ever since the Mac Mini was rejuvenated back in 2020, I think it was, with the M1 chip, I've been obsessed with it, a bit like the MacBook Air, which was kind of clearly waiting around for Intel to be kicked out the back door and Apple Silicon to come in. The Mac Mini was doing the exact same thing. However, it was still the same chassis that we'd had for 10 years. Now we have a proper Apple Silicon ready chassis. It's tiny, it's got ports on the front, it's got no USB-A, and yes, the power button is on the bottom of it. I'll get to that in a moment, but look at it. Yes, you need a mouse, a keyboard, and a monitor as well, but it's such a great starting point, and you can build your own rig around this thing. The big question is, does this tiny frame mean that the fan comes on more regularly and, more importantly, or more worryingly, that the performance is throttled, which means, you know, it gets hot, the fan comes on, and it slows down. Does that happen? Let's find out. Okay, let's very quickly go through the specs of the base model M4 Mac Mini. So the chip in here has a 10-core CPU, which consists of 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. It has a 10-core GPU, and it starts with 16 gig of unified memory, which means the 8 gig version does not exist anymore. It's gone. And you can upgrade it as far as 32 gig. If you want more than that, you have to go for the M4 Pro version, but the base model has 16, 24, or 32 gig. Storage, 256 gig to begin with, and that can go right up to 2 terabytes if you want to remortgage your house. On the back, we have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, a HDMI port, and Ethernet, and power, obviously. On the front, we have 2 USB-C ports and a headphone jack. In the box, you get this and a power cable, and that's it. So it's basically, like I say, a starting point for your Mac setup, and it costs £599 or $599. In terms of the design, I've talked a lot about this in my M4 Pro Mac Mini review, so I won't kind of regurgitate all of that, but what I will do is a very quick fire opinion on what matters. The power button placement does not matter, so it shouldn't really be in this list. The size is now perfect. Those front ports are immediately useful. The front-facing headphone jack works for me. The removal of USB-A was inevitable. The lack of iMac-like colors, no SD card slot, the braided power cable, nice. But the big question is, does this massive reduction in size have any impact on the thermals and the fan noise? I decided to run some tests. Now, I've done these tests on both the M4 Pro Mac Mini and also my M3 Max MacBook Pro just for kicks, just to see where this stands between those two machines. And as always, guys, I'm not a proper benchmarker. These are very, very rough and ready tests, but I think they do represent what a lot of people do in the real world. They involve 3 different apps: Logic Pro, Final Cut Pro, and Lightroom. And then at the end of that, I do a great big stress test to really try and break this thing. And I will be doing loads and loads more stuff with the M4 Mac Mini, so if you don't want to miss that, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell. By the way, guys, lots and lots of people who watch this channel regularly haven't done that yet. So if you do watch this channel and you enjoy it and you've just forgotten to press that button, give it a little click, please. Thank you. Starting with Final Cut Pro, I took a recently edited YouTube video, which is about 8-9 minutes long, and exported it to an MOV file. Now that project is quite chunky. It's a multicam setup, so there's 3 different cameras going on. They're all 4K 10-bit footage from this Sony camera in front of me, so it's a fairly big deal. I did this export on both the M4 Pro Mac Mini and the M3 Max MacBook Pro. On here, That export took 3 minutes and 38 seconds, and during that time the CPU kind of hovered around 20% and the GPU hovered around about 35%, so it wasn't really troubled, and no, there wasn't an ounce of fan noise, nothing at all. And also moving around the timeline and cutting things up and doing all that sort of stuff, this thing was silent. So 3 minutes and 38 seconds for that export. The M4 Pro Mac Mini did it in 3 minutes and 27 seconds, so a little bit quicker, but not by much. But the M3 Max MacBook Pro, which cost a lot of money compared to this, did it in 3 minutes and 57 seconds, so nearly 20 seconds slower. Onto Lightroom, and this was basically a case of taking 100 raw photos from my Sony camera and exporting them to large JPEG format. Not a massively intensive task, but it's something that a lot of photographers will do. And on the M4 Pro Mac Mini, that took 23 seconds, and it took 23 seconds on the M3 Max MacBook Pro as well. On this little base model, it took 2 minutes and 11 seconds, which is quite a bit slower. Although, during my testing, the Lightroom export was very inconsistent. I ran it again. I think the second time it took 2 minutes and 31 seconds. Even the M4 Pro Mac Mini and the M3 Max MacBook Pro, they took longer for absolutely no reason whatsoever when I first ran it. I think one of them took 6 minutes and then it went down to 23 seconds. So I can't figure that out, I'm afraid. This is why I'm not a benchmarker. But even so, 100 raw files, these are big files. 2 minutes and 11 seconds to export them. You couldn't even make a cup of tea in that time, I don't think. And once again, no fan noise. Next up, Logic Pro, and if you're not aware, Logic Pro is a DAW, as they call them. It's basically a music audio workstation. Now, I know this thing like the back of my hands. I could basically go to town with this, and what I've done is create this huge 128 track monster of a, can we call it a song? No, we can't call it a song. It sounds horrific, but there's a reason for that. It's basically 128 tracks of MIDI, of audio, and even AI drummers. And it's basically a 4-minute cacophony, 4 minutes of noise, basically. It's biblically stupid. I don't think anyone would ever make a project like this in Logic Pro. The fact this thing opens at all on this, for someone who used to use an Atari ST and Cubase back in 1992, that alone is amazing. The fact you can open it and even use Logic Pro on a 599 quid Mac Mini is just mind-blowing. And it did work. I could scroll around, I could move things about, I could hit play, and it would immediately respond. And once again, not an ounce of fan noise. As part of that test, I decided to export to an MP3 file, so basically taking that entire 4-minute thing and exporting it to MP3. On the M4 Pro Mac Mini, that took 53 seconds. On the M3 Max MacBook Pro, that took 56 seconds. That's very, very quick, by the way. On this, it took 1 minute and 53 seconds, which is pretty quick. And even more impressively, once again, no fan noise, no anything really. The CPU was sitting at 40% while it was doing this. It was just chilling. So I thought, okay, it smashed all 3 of those kind of rudimentary tests. How do we break it? In my M4 Pro Mac Mini video, I did a stress test where I opened Logic Pro, Final Cut Pro, Lightroom, and as many apps as I could on the dock. In fact, just everything basically. That was the only thing that made the fan come on. It still performed perfectly. It didn't slow down, it didn't crash, it didn't give me any error messages. It carried on performing, and the fan noise was very quiet. It wasn't loud, it wasn't annoying. The machine got hot, but not too hot to touch. It was just still relatively chilled. So I thought, well, let's do the exact same thing on here. And that's what I did. I opened up all of those apps and it did kill it a little bit. In fairness, everything was fine to begin with. It let me open all of those apps and most of them were still responsive. There was no kind of slowdown between, switching between apps and that sort of stuff. It went wrong when I pressed play on Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro. At that point, after a few seconds, I got the system overload message from Final Cut Pro, which basically means you're trying to do too much on this, mate. Chill out, which is absolutely fair. Again, a bit like that 128 track Logic Pro thing. That stress test is a stress test as far as I'm concerned because it's such an unlikely usage scenario. If you do that kind of thing, you're not watching this video. You're buying an M4 Pro Mac Mini, you're buying a Mac Studio, a Mac Pro probably as well, or a MacBook Pro. You're not buying a base model 599 Mac Mini. The fact that it even allowed me to open all of that stuff and not complain until I tried to, start two things at once is impressive. And it leaves me with one very important question. Who is the base model M4 Mac Mini for? That's lots of fours, but you know what I mean. Who should be buying this one? I think most people who want a Mac Mini should get this. The fact it starts with 16 gig of unified memory is it's a bit of a no-brainer now. And equally, if you've got a bit of extra money, put it into more memory if you need to, or go up to 512 gig of storage. I know there's still this thing about, is the 512 gig one faster than the 256? I don't know. I don't have the 512 one to hand, but as you've seen hopefully today, the things you can do with this are utterly nuts. Most people watching this video, me included, can't max out this thing. And yes, I did in my stress test, but that is not my typical usage. If you're running a creative business, or if you're a coder or someone where every second counts, then the M4 Pro with lots of memory is probably going to be a very good investment for your business. But for everyone else, just get this. I think the base model M4 Mac Mini is Apple's best ever Mac. Is it their best ever product? I need a bit longer with it to kind of come to that conclusion, but it's so close. Is it their best ever product? You know what? It is. At this price point, with this much performance, I can't think of anything that comes close. There's two things that make an epic tech product. Number one is fantastic value for money, and number two is just the feeling you get when you use it. There's just something about the Mac Mini that makes you happy every time you turn it on. You don't turn it on, forget that. Every time you start using this, it's just joyful. We can't ask for any more from tech. They have absolutely nailed it with this. But I'd love to know, are you buying a base model M4 Mac Mini, and what are you doing with it? Let me know in the comments, and if you're curious about the M4 Pro version, hang around for a link.